Jean, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me here.
So, Jean, you may not know this, but I have been following you already for a few years. This is this is one of the books that you wrote, and which is like a Bible. It's very thick, as compared to your new book, 72 Reasons to Be Vegan. But just to let you know that I am already familiarized with your work, but my listeners are not. So I wonder if you could give us a little bit of your background. How do you get started as an author? Because you have put out 50 books into the market. So I feel comfortable saying that this is your full-time career.
Yeah, it is definitely my full-time career. I actually started off as a book editor, a magazine editor. I was a newspaper editor, but I didn't like being on the editing side. So when my last job kind of fell apart, I thought, well, this would be a good time to start writing. But I'm a very good editor. I don't know that I'm as good a writer as I am an editor. So a lot of what I've done is ghostwriting, which is something that combines the skills of writing with the skills of editing, because I'm working with people, working with their words, giving them a voice. And so I would say of the 50 books I've written, probably maybe 40 of them I wrote with other people. 10 of them I wrote on my own. And then I was also very interested in health, workplace social responsibility, and things like that. So a lot of my books were in that area, but about 15 years ago, I met a firefighter in Texas. My agent called up and said, "You want to write a book with this firefighter?" And I said, I don't think so, because what would I have in common with a Texas firefighter? But he said, no, this guy's really interesting, and he's vegan. And I knew the word. I knew what, I had weird associations with it, like a lot of people did back 15 years ago. But I thought, okay, so I met the guy named Rip Esselstyn, and Rip and I went on to write actually 3 books together, The Engine 2 Diet, and 2 more books in that area. Rip also started a whole line of foods at Whole Foods based on those books. But not being vegan at the time, I thought, well, if I'm going to write a book about being vegan, I kind of think, participatory journalism a good thing. So, and then, I'll just jump in. I'll try it for a couple of weeks and see how it goes. Didn't really think it was going to go well, but I got hooked. And within a month, my cholesterol level had dropped, I think 50 points. I felt really good. And then I began to learn more about being vegan. I had started off, like many people do, as a health vegan, concerned about what it does for your health. But then I met Brian Wendell, who was doing this movie, Forks Over Knives. And he and I got along, and I said, well, we should do a book together. I could write a book called Forks Over Knives while you have a documentary called Forks Over Knives come out at the same time. And that's what we did. So I wrote that book. And in doing that book, I then learned more about animal protection. I met Gene Bauer, who is the guy who founded Farm Sanctuary. And then we ended up writing a book. And then I also eventually met a guy named Neil Zacharias, who was very interested in the relationship between veganism and environmentalism. So then I ended up writing a book with him about the environment. So, so there I was all of a sudden, like not knowing anything about it. And the next thing I know, I've written 12 books about plant-based diets and the relationship to health, animal welfare, and the environment.
Well, they say that writing is a very lonely career, but it seems like you have made most of your friends to writing. Let me ask you, in your previous career as an editor, and you got to meet many people in the scientific area, for example, Stephen Hawking. Did you have to learn in depth the subject that they were writing about? For example, do you have to learn about black holes and the universe and all this and that?
When I was younger, I was actually pretty smart. I don't think I am anymore, but I was actually very smart when I was a kid, actually up until I was about 40. Then your mind begins to whatever. But yeah, so when you are writing these books, you do have to really learn the subject matter. It's like being in graduate school. Every couple of years, you have a new course. I was actually always very interested in astrophysics and wished that when I was young, I had paid more attention to science. I was the typical liberal arts guy who just didn't pay any attention at all. In fact, I don't even remember taking any science courses. But in order to write that book, I took 2 years off and basically learned everything I could, which, by the way, is like minimal compared to what they knew. I mean, I got to the point where I could ask intelligent questions. That's about it. But they did have me write the glossary to that book. And that actually is the proudest intellectual achievement of my lifetime, that I was able to write a glossary for a book that Stephen Hawking approved.
Oh, amazing. And in your book, 72 Reasons to Be Vegan, you tell us the story of how you used to love meat and how you were meat crazy. Can you tell us about your previous life as a meat eater?
Yeah, I was a total meataholic. You know, I grew up in a typical middle-class suburb of New York, and, you know, on Monday we'd have pot roast, and on Wednesday we'd have turkey, and Thursday we'd have steak, and it's all I would eat. So, like, I hated vegetables so much that I would sit at the kitchen table when there's a little drawer right beneath where I sat. So when my mother wasn't looking, I would take all the vegetables and put them in the drawer. So, and they, again, I wasn't smart enough to realize that if you put all these rotting vegetables in the drawer, eventually, you know, you have to take them out. And I didn't do that. So they caught me, and they eventually said to me, you have to eat your vegetables. And I wouldn't do it. But if you had told me as a 14-year-old that one day my diet would consist almost entirely of vegetables and fruits and legumes, I would have said, you're nuts. Never, ever would have happened. But it did.
Wow. Well, let me just take a second to share my story. I got into veganism because of a beautiful woman. She told me, you wanna date me? We had to go to vegan restaurants, and if we're ever living together, no cooking of meat in my apartment. So I did that just to please her. I actually would go and eat meat here and there outside of the house. But eventually, you know, through conversations and interaction, and this other book that she gave me, How Not to Die, I became a believer. And now it's been a few years since I follow plant-based diet. So to each his and that's almost like the reason why a lot of men join yoga classes, because okay, so Jean, I'm not gonna. I'm going to ask you about the book, how the idea came about writing this book, and how is it that you developed this partnership with Kathy Preston, who is your co-author here?
Well, you know, again, I've written books that are about health. I've written books about the environment. I've written books about animal protection. Other people have written similar kinds of books in these different areas. But people would often ask me, well, I just want to read one book. And it occurred to me that even though there are all these different books in different areas, there really wasn't one book, an easy to read, simple book that simply explained why you should be vegan. So it seemed to me like if you see that there's an absence, you fill it up. And then, as you said a minute ago, even though writing is a lonely profession, and I do get lonely, because I get lonely, I really do like writing books for other people. Kathy, I had met actually through RIP many years ago, and we really got along. And so for years we talked about, gee, we should do a book together, but never could think of one. And it turned out she felt the same way I did, that there really should be this kind of book. So we thought, gee, if we both want to write this book, let's do it together. And we did. And I have to say, not all partnerships work well. I think we all know that sometimes they don't work at all. But Kathy and I get along really well. And we had a lot of fun doing this. And I think we're both really proud of what we did.
Well, I mean, you should be the book and not only give us 72 reasons to be vegan, but it's also a beautiful piece of art. I mean, the graphics are great. The book designer, he deserves a lot of props because it's a very well done book. Now, let me tell you, when I spoke to Kathy, I asked her 2 reasons to share with my audience to be vegan. And we don't want to give the 72 reasons because we want people to buy the book. But I wonder if you could share with the audience 2 random reasons why we should be vegan.
Okay, well, The first one that I really like is called Fiber is Your Body's Bitch.
Mm,
And the point
interesting
here,
title.
right. Well, we're trying to be a little hip here. Um, we want the book to be accessible and funny, and I think to some degree it probably is.
Yes, I had to interject there. The book is extremely funny. You have all kind of smart, um, um, smart things like that. So I laugh every other page when I was reading it.
Yeah. And the point of this chapter is simply that most people do not eat enough fiber. Insoluble fiber, soluble fiber, they're both absolutely necessary for our health, for our digestion, and for pooping really well. So we talk about why it's important and the fact that if you're eating primarily animal-based products, you're not going to get the proper amount of fiber. So it's important that people realize that when they think about carbohydrates and they think about fat and they think about protein, they need to be thinking about fiber too. We think that should be as important in people's minds when they figure out what they're going to eat as carbohydrates, fat, and protein.
Okay. Okay. So fiber is the beach. Can you give us one more reason why we should be vegan?
Well, I have a chapter here called Go Fish, No Fish.
Okay.
Because a lot of times people will say, well, I kind of get what you're saying about little lambs and little sweet little calves and little animals with big eyes and they're so sweet. But fish, that doesn't, who cares?
I used to say that.
Most people say that,
Okay.
people think fish, they're just like weird little things swim around and who cares? But the fact is, I've learned a lot about fish. They have personalities. They can be as endearing and weird and interesting as the mammals that we know. But more importantly, from an environmental point of view, we're pretty much destroying the oceans in the sense that I think it's 2048. According to the last UN report I read, if we keep fishing at the rate we're fishing, there will literally be no more fish left in the ocean because we are draining the ocean of fish. We're destroying the ecosystems there. We're basically doing the same thing to the oceans that we're doing to the land. So even though you might think, well, fish, it's not a big deal, it is a big deal. So we have maybe 7 or 8 chapters on the importance of keeping fish out of your diet. Also, frankly, from a health point of view, because we don't feel that animal protein is good, we also talk about how farmed fish really aren't the problem solver either because they pollute their environment. There's a number of things they do that even though it sounds like they might be good for you, they're not. So fish.
Okay. Well, let me ask you, not to get political, but how can we, I mean, I live in Canada, and here the Canadian government subsidizes the meat industry and the dairy industry. In fact, we have something called supply chain whatever, where Canada is protected against any import from cheese, dairy, eggs, whatever. But I'm sure in the United States there is all kind of protections and incentives and subsidies towards the meat industry. And I wonder how a regular individual like you and me could at least say, well, fine if you want to eat meat, but stop subsidizing this industry with taxpayers' money.
It's a real problem. There's a book I've been meaning to write for some time called The $25,000 Hamburger. And the idea being that even though you think that hamburger may just cost $3, all of the money that goes into supporting the system, all of the incentives that farmers or people that raise these cows are given, et cetera, that it's enormously expensive, the entire animal agricultural system. So really the only thing you can do, I think, as an individual is stop eating it. Because if people stop eating it, then they won't be able to support the industry because the industry will be dying. It's been fascinating to watch. A lot of these major meat producers actually are now investing in the places, the Impossible Burgers, or in the clean meat, the meat that's coming from cells grown in laboratories. So I do think that the meat people see the writing on the wall. And I would guess that in maybe 20 or 30 years, people will eat much more meat that either comes from a cell-grown base or is plant-based than they will be eating meat that comes from slaughterhouses.
And you think the tipping point will be maybe when these alternative meats, like Impossible Beef or Impossible Meats and Beyond Meat. By the way, I'm a shareholder of Beyond Meat. You think the tipping point is when they are cheaper than the real life cattle beef?
Well, the substitutes have to be cheaper, they have to be accessible, and they have to taste good. So you have to meet all those three criteria. At this point, they do taste really good. People I know who are meat eaters will have an Impossible Burger or Beyond Burger, and they'll think, "No, this is just like eating a hamburger." Um, they're not quite cheap enough yet. They're still a little more expensive than they should be, but the price will come down as the technology goes up. Um, and accessibility is actually getting pretty good. It was for a while only the in the health food stores where you could buy these things. Um, I go to the normal supermarket around the corner from me, and they now have a whole section of alternative meats, alternative cheeses, alternative meats. And this is just your basic grocery store for anybody. It's not a health food store. So accessibility is now, I think, is good, at least well, I live in California. I'm not totally sure if you were in, New Brunswick, or if you were in Iowa, it would be the same. I don't know.
Right. Okay. I started my podcast about 3 years ago, and I used to talk mostly about money and how can people save money. And I know there is an element of money saving when you have a plant-based diet. I wonder if you could share that with us.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that plant-based diets get a bad rap on is that they're expensive. But that's when you start thinking about going out to a fancy restaurant and having a vegan meal. The fact is that a plant-based diet can really be based on rice and beans, which are probably the two foods I eat the most. And that's about as cheap as it gets. So if you're paying attention and you go to a farmer's market, you're looking for vegetables that are in season, you're looking for fruits that are in season, you're basing your diet on rice and beans and tortillas and whole grain tortillas, you can actually eat a lot cheaper than if you're eating a animal-based diet. So at this point, I think that, as I said, there was a time when it was more expensive, but it isn't now. So you can save money and be vegan.
Well, and how about we live in this society where we have all these options to buy this and that, but we know that a great part of people in the world are going hungry, and I know that veganism can solve part of that problem. I wonder how can it contribute to stop world hunger?
Well, we actually have a chapter on that I think is, we can solve world hungers, chapter 14. So good point. There are a number of things there, but I think the major one I could just bring up simply is, if you think about it, so much grain, so much of the products that we raise, we actually feed to the cows and to the pigs and to the other animals, then we eat them. But if we eliminate the middle animal, we can just eat those grains that were actually going to the animals. So that's an enormous step forward in solving world hunger, because all of a sudden there's this enormous amount, I think it's like 80% of all the grains raised are raised for animals. We could take that 80% and give it to people instead, and that would go a long way to solving world hunger.
Wow. I just have one, in my experience as a vegan, I just have one little complaint against veganism is whenever I go to a restaurant that qualify itself as a vegan restaurant, somehow the prices in the menu, even though it's the same menu as, as a regular restaurant, somehow the prices are about 20% higher. So I always tell them.
I know what you're saying. And there are a few restaurants where I live in Los Angeles where, in fact, I'm about to go have lunch at Crossroads, which is a wonderful restaurant. It's one of my very favorite in the world, but it's not cheap. But on the other hand, we now have places called Veggie Grill, for instance. And Veggie Grill is kind of like McDonald's, but it's vegan. And you can go there and have a good meal and spend $8.
Okay, great. Well, Jean, this is an amazing, it's for me, it's a very easy read. There are some scientific terms that I had to go to the Google machine and try to figure out what they are. Just one last question. How do you figure out which chapter you will write and which chapter Kathy will write?
That was something I was a little concerned with in the beginning because I thought, what if we all both want to write the same stuff? But, it didn't even turn out to be an issue. We would just say, what do you want to do? What do I want to do? Kathy wrote more about sex. Yeah. I wrote more about world hunger. So that's what she thinks about. That's what I think about.
Okay, well, Jean, can you tell us one more time the title of the book and where people can follow you and buy it?
72 Reasons to be Vegan. And I would like to think you could buy it at any bookstore now that they're opening again. I would love to see you go and support an independent bookstore. But of course, you can always go to Amazon, you can go to Barnes & Noble, or there's a new consortium of independent booksellers with their new website. And I would encourage people to look that up and go there as well.
I'm just going to add one more reason. If you are vegan, you have a better immune system, which will protect us better against the coronavirus.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Jing. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Bye.